Hello there, and welcome to another episode of Behemoth, blogs by TJ Gonin. And as you can see, we have here something different to look at. This is a lovely painting by my wife, and I'm thinking of featuring a different one each time. And anyway, this blog is called "The Concise History of Everything." It's from 2015. In the beginning, the waters were gathered into one place, the Bible tells us. So presumably the land was also unified, at least until the time of Peleg, because Peleg means division. After the flood, prior to the biblical flood, the Bible seems to say that all animals and humans ate fruit, seeds, grass, and vegetables. I would go so far as to speculate that the pre-flood ecology was such that human life, for example, could be prolonged for hundreds of years. In practical terms, this may have meant that the animals lived in harmony and did not change or adapt their forms to suit relatively harsh or dangerous environments, but the environment was relatively perfect for life. Although, since then I've come to believe that when the Bible says the earth was corrupted by violence or something, I think that means that there were the conditions not in terms for survival and food, but rather for the animals competing violently, perhaps for breeding privileges, which may, as I have put in more blogs I've done more lately, have said may have been the cause for huge dinosaurs and such, because of course they too could live for many hundreds of years. In any case, continuing with the blog, technology developed to the point of ironwork. There was music and culture, and people lived in cities. This the Bible states plainly in the first few chapters. There was also violence, with which God was not pleased, and he decided to wipe out almost all life on earth. There was water above the sky, like the water under the sky in those days, except of course that you'll be able to see the stars and the sun and the moon through it, because I'm pretty sure the Bible says it's for signs and for seasons, and I presume that was starting right at the beginning there. And when this fell over a period of 40 days and nights, combined with water raising up from somewhere deep beneath the earth's surface, it flooded the earth to cover the highest mountain. The water from under the earth receded, presumably leaving the extra water from above the sky to cycle through the cloud sequence and raise the general water level permanently. And remembering, of course, that the Bible says some of the waters that came from under the earth were returned to that place. Judging by the puzzle-like form of the land surfaces on earth today, the earth was divided, perhaps at the time of Peleg, about 150 years after the flood, and the Bible tells us that the nations were divided, or sometimes later, but I would guess between 500 BCE. And just to add to that, Peleg means divisions. Seems pretty clear now to me that when it says the division, it's actually talking about the division of the nations because of the Tower of Babel. So in other words, the time of Peleg was the time of Babel, the Tower of Babel, which, as I think I mentioned in more later editions of this history that I like to do every now and then, that this wasn't much before the time of Abraham. So there you have a time gap of about, I think, around 400 years from the flood to Abraham. And of course, Shem, the son of Noah, was still alive in the time of Jacob. So Abraham, as I mentioned in later editions of this, was actually alive in the very first iteration of human civilization, which means, of course, that when the Bible says Ur of the Chaldeans, it's talking about ancient Sumer. There's absolutely no doubt about this. In terms of timelines, so yeah, just a little bit of a note there. After about 1,000 to 1,500 years or so of pre-flood existence, I think they put the date of 1656 there. 7 pairs of clean animals, like doves and sheep. 2 pairs of unclean animals, like cats and dogs. Now, let us suppose going on the dimensions of the ark with 3 levels, and being in total 200 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 350 feet. And 45 feet high, I think. If that's the dimensions. With the bottom level for grain, and of course a ballast, there may have been about 360 different kinds of animals, ranging in size from small mice to large elephant ancestors, perhaps the size of a cow. And I will add here also rhinoceroses, hippopotamuses, elephants. These are literally dinosaurs in terms of their size, Stegosaurus and such, Triceratops. They would have looked very, very similar to these creatures, grey skin and the rest of it. Mammals, basically. So when you're talking about rhinoceros, you're talking about a kind of Triceratops, which of course means that the Triceratops may have been on the ark, and perhaps the rhinoceros is an adapted form of that. So, it's a possibility, I guess. From these animals came all the different animals that exist now, and that appear as fossils. Of course, fossils appearing in the fossil record because of the flood. Fossils aren't generating today, as far as I know, in those massive quantities. And the way they're all bunched together has been shown by Answers in Genesis. You can look up on YouTube that the flood may have caused these huge bone graveyards to collect in these central areas of continents as the floodwaters washed over them and brought them to a kind of sort of a centralized location, down a line down the middle of the continents. That's one theory there. During this adaptive process, these animals maintain the integrity of quote-unquote kind. That is to say, dogs didn't turn into dolphins or something. They stayed in their cones. However, there need be no limits to the range of color, size, or general appearance as seen within the range of domestic dog breeds, Chihuahua to Great Dane. We've got in brackets there. The silt laid down upon the earth by the receding floodwaters allowed for the rapid regrowth of plants and so on, to provide the advancing birds and natural herbivores a great deal of advantage of a wild type of animal such as the cats or cat predecessor, which presumably lacked such impressive sets of fangs at that stage. And that could also be wrong. If there was violence in the animals as well as humans before the flood, then all those adaptations could have come about not for eating, but for, fighting each other. The competition was then purely between the herbivores, and in the absence of predators at this early point, meant bigger was better, as the fossil record attests. And again, this is theoretical. I think large animals come about mainly in the absence of human beings, but in pre-flood we're talking about super large animals. And this adaptive process eventually culminated in the biblical Behemoth of the book of Job. Once again, I'm pretty sure the brontosaurus, or whatever you want to call it, was from before the flood. Mammal, living like a hippopotamus, except being gigantic. My son mentioned that the long neck kind of meant it didn't actually need to get out of the water to eat the foliage from trees. Anyway, the biblical Behemoth from the book of Job, which is clearly some sort of brontosaurus. Illustrations of this animal by ancient Mesopotamians on cylinder seals shows a mammal with mammalian features seen also on elephants, giraffes, and kangaroos. Now, I don't know from which existing animal this massive beast is descended from, and that's true if it's from before the flood too. Mind you, God has basically just created it straight up like that, so something to think about. But I do believe that God, as a perfect designer, designed all his creations to survive, at least in some form, no matter what. Thus, whatever kind of animal the so-called brontosaurus was, it must still exist in some form, perhaps more closely related to its ark-going forebear, or if the brontosaurus was on the ark. Don't ask me how. then this descendant would be smaller, of course. Kind of interesting to think about. What's first, the chicken or the egg? Was the brontosaurus taken on the ark and then it became smaller, some sort of creature now, or was it something that came about in the ideal conditions, an adapted form of something in the ideal conditions before the flood? Carrying on here, human beings were all one people at this time, the Bible says. So suppose they were all Adam or earth red and had little differentiation of features. The adaptations by which we differentiate ourselves today were probably hundreds of years off, culminating, I suppose, in the mighty Neanderthal, which, judging by the bone structure, is the most adapted human form as far as I know. That is to say, they're short, squat, and very, very strong, surviving in the most brutal conditions. I think I saw one documentary and they basically had evidence in their bones of a lot of injuries that they suppose might have come about by trying to hunt large deer and such without pits, or just basically attacking them with clubs or something crazy, I don't know. Whilst human technology and culture grew back in leaps and bounds in Mesopotamia, the animals and humans that ventured forth further out into the brand new earth must surely have struggled both against each other and their environment. The path of human recolonization from the current great rich regions of the Zagros Mountains in modern-day Iraq through ancient Sumer and then throughout the earth would have been a slow and painful process. But I nonetheless estimate that every continent had humans on it after only a few hundred years, and of course I'm not really sure about that. Perhaps countries like New Zealand, where I was born, it's possible that took them a lot longer to get there, and of course the incredible skill of the Polynesian sailors. Although there are legends of Maui that suggest that there might have been people when some of those land masses came out of the water. It seems to suggest they witnessed that. Anyway, carrying on. Whether the Earth was at some stage decimated by objects from space like giant meteors and ice ages cannot be proven empirically. Pretty sure meteors probably have crashed down. There's definitely the meteor holes and the historical record events of massive, decades and even centuries of darkness and such, which could be explained by either meteors or volcanoes and so on. Anyway, there was surely at least one more great cataclysm following the flood, however, reflected in the global drought at the time of Joseph, son of the great biblical pharaoh Jacob. The success of the mega herbivores such as the so-called brontosaurus was followed up by the rise of terrible birds, culminating in the incredible Tyrannosaurus rex. And I'm pretty sure that's a creature from before the flood. Well, in fact, the fact that it is, I mean, the fossil record testifies to that. If the fossil record is the result of the flood, then Brontosaurus, Tyrannosaurus rex are creatures from before the flood. I don't know whether they were created that way or whether they were adapted because of the violent nature of their existence. Anyway, which I believe was a giant terror bird but with extra adaptations of teeth and tails. Fossils in birds with teeth and tails have been found, so I know this is possible. Unfortunately, to see one of these things was probably a death sentence, seeing as they were probably very fast with a good vision and smell, and no doubt always hungry. And of course, if they lived before the flood, they wouldn't have been hungry. They could eat grass. And there's some evidence, I think one paleontologist theorized that T-Rexes were actually herbivores, so there you go. Thus, no historical illustrations of these creatures remain. However, there's none have been discovered. However, something akin to what I believe they were exists in a description in the story of an ancient Egyptian literature. That's right, and the medieval book Orlando Furioso has a very clear description of an ornithochirus with black feathers, taking a horse, and of course, the story in the ancient Egyptian literature is a rainbow-colored talking dragon covered in feathers. Parrots talk, so who knows. The ultimate predators were on the way, however, and it was only a matter of time before the great cats or wolves arrived on the scene, coming into being, no doubt, in the middle ground between civilization and the Dinotopia. With the humans following close behind, it would have only taken the slightest disturbance in the mega beast ecosystems to bring the whole thing crashing down. Predation on megabeast young, competition for food sources, anything. Mammals and birds of the biggest dinosaur proportions would have had constant access to easily accessible food sources to survive. Just as the last of the great creatures of the fossil record were despairing, human history was beginning to take on a global phase, and the great civilizations of the earth were firmly establishing their claims on the historical record. And I just want to add here that, as a matter of fact, God says one of the punishments for people not doing what's right, according to the Bible, is that animals of such nature will come into the land as to make it impossible for humans to colonize. And this is one of the reasons why God didn't destroy the inhabitants of Canaan before the Israelites came there, because if there was no one in the land that would have been fertile, it could have ended up looking something like the savannas of Africa with huge creatures, except maybe even more so because in Africa, I guess they had people living there, which must have had some limiting effect on how big and dangerous animals got, perhaps. Anyway, eventually the subterranean biomass laid down by the Great Flood would be discovered by modern man in the form of oil and natural gas, and the age of modern technology would begin. And that's the end of that blog for today. Thanks for listening.